Imagine a warrior so legendary that 1,000 years after his death, we still can't tell where the man ends and the myth begins. A Viking who supposedly conquered kingdoms, outsmarted kings, and died laughing in a pit of venomous snakes. His sons would go on to terrorize all of Europe, carving out empires from England to the Mediterranean. But here's the twist. We're not even sure he actually existed. And if he did, almost everything you think you know about him is probably wrong. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of history's most fascinating mysteries, Ragnar Lothbrok. If you've watched Vikings, you know the character. The farmer who becomes a king, the explorer who discovers new lands, the warrior who challenges the gods themselves. But how much of that is real? Where does history end and legend begin? And why does it matter? By the time we're done, you'll understand why historians have been arguing about this man for centuries, and why the truth might actually be more interesting than the fiction. If you love history, mythology, and untangling the truth behind legendary figures, hit that subscribe button right now. We're building a community of people who want the real stories, not just the Hollywood versions. And trust me, this rabbit hole goes deep. Let's begin. The Vikings TV series made Ragnar Lothbrok a household name. Played brilliantly by Travis Fimmel, he's the charismatic hero who rises from nothing to become a legendary king. But here's what the show doesn't tell you at the beginning. In actual historical records, Ragnar Lothbrok appears in exactly 0 contemporary sources. 0. There are no Viking Age documents that say, and then Ragnar Lothbrok did this thing. Everything we know about him comes from stories written hundreds of years after he supposedly lived. Stories that were written down by people who weren't even there. Stories that mix historical events, different people, and pure mythology into one legendary figure. So let's start with what we actually know, and then we'll separate fact from fiction. The name Ragnar Lothbrok first appears in writings from the 13th century, about 400 years after the Viking Age. The two main sources are the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, which is basically a medieval novel, and Saxo Grammaticus's History of the Danes, which is part history, part legend, and part propaganda. Both sources tell wild stories about a warrior named Ragnar who had multiple wives, many famous sons, and died a dramatic death. But they don't always agree on the details. In fact, they contradict each other constantly. Here's where it gets interesting. While we can't prove Ragnar Lothbrok existed, we can prove that many of the events attributed to him actually happened, and we can prove that some of the people in his story definitely existed. Let's talk about the Great Heathen Army. This was a massive Viking force that invaded England in 865. Historical records from England confirm this happened. They also confirmed that this army was led by several Viking commanders, including someone named Ivar the Boneless, and possibly his brothers. And according to legend, Ivar the Boneless was Ragnar's son. Now here's the puzzle. Did Ragnar exist and father these very real historical figures? Or did medieval storytellers look back at these famous Viking leaders and invent a legendary father to explain their greatness? It's like asking whether King Arthur was real or if storytellers created him to connect various British legends. The answer is, we honestly don't know, but we can look at the clues. Let's examine the name itself. Ragnar was a common Norse name. It means something like ruler's army or warrior of the gods. Lothbrok, or Lodbrok in Old Norse, means hairy breeches or shaggy pants. That's an odd nickname, right? According to legend, Ragnar earned this name because he wore special hairy leather pants when fighting a dragon or a giant serpent that was protecting the woman he wanted to marry. Yes, a dragon. Already we're seeing the mythology creeping in. But here's the thing. Nicknames in Viking culture often came from real events, even if the stories got exaggerated over time. So maybe there was a warrior named Ragnar who wore distinctive pants, and the dragon story got added later. Some historians think Ragnar Lothbrok is actually a composite character, meaning he's made up of several different real Vikings whose stories got merged over the centuries. Let's look at the candidates. There was a Viking leader named Ragnar who attacked Paris in 845. French records confirm this raid happened. A massive Viking fleet sailed up the Seine River, and the Frankish king Charles the Bald had to pay them off with silver to make them leave. Some historians think Ragnar might be Ragnar. The names are similar, and the timeline works. Then there's Ragnar, a Viking chieftain who was active in the early 900s and appears in Irish annals. He raided Ireland and possibly parts of Scotland. Could this be our Ragnar? Maybe, or maybe this is just another Viking named Ragnar since it was such a common name. It's like trying to figure out if all the medieval accounts of someone named John are talking about the same person. Good luck with that. And here's where it gets even more complicated. The sagas describe Ragnar having multiple wives. The most famous are Lagertha, the shield maiden warrior woman, and Aslaug, who was supposedly the daughter of the legendary hero Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. Yes, more dragons. Lagertha is a fantastic character in the Viking series, but historically she appears in only one source, Saxo Grammaticus, and even there her story is brief and clearly mixed with folklore. Did she exist? Possibly. Was she exactly as described? Almost certainly not. Aslaug's story is even more mythological. According to legend, Ragnar saw her from a distance and was so struck by her beauty that he sent his men to bring her to him. But he demanded she arrive not dressed, not undressed, not hungry, not full, and not alone, not in company. She showed up wrapped in fishing net, having tasted an onion with a dog at her side. Clever, right? But this is clearly a folk tale, the kind of riddle story that appears in cultures all over the world. It's not history, it's mythology. So if the wives are questionable, what about the sons? Here's where things get really interesting, because unlike Ragnar, some of his sons definitely existed. Ivar the Boneless is mentioned in multiple English chronicles. He was one of the leaders of the great Heathen army that conquered much of England. His nickname, the Boneless, has sparked endless debate. Did he have a physical disability? Was it a mistranslation, meaning he was incredibly flexible? Was it a euphemism for something else? We don't know, but we know he was real, and we know he was terrifyingly effective as a military commander.
Then there's Bjorn Ironside, who, according to legend, raided throughout the Mediterranean and tried to sack Rome, but accidentally attacked a different Italian city, thinking it was Rome. There are historical records of Viking raids in the Mediterranean in the 860s, so this might be based on real events. Whether the leader was actually named Bjorn and whether he was Ragnar's son, that's where it gets fuzzy. Sigurd, Snake in the Eye, Hvitserk, Ubba, these names all appear in various chronicles and sagas, sometimes as brothers, sometimes not. The medieval writers seem to look at all the famous Viking warriors of the mid-900s and decide they must all be related. It makes for a great story, but is it true? That's much harder to prove. Now, let's talk about Ragnar's death, because this is one of the most famous parts of the legend. According to the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar was captured by King Aelle of Northumbria and thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. As the snakes bit him, Ragnar supposedly laughed and sang a poem about his glorious life, ending with the phrase, "How the little pigs would squeal if they knew how the old boar suffers," the little pigs being his sons. This death scene is incredibly dramatic. It's also incredibly suspicious from a historical standpoint. First, King Aelle was a real person who ruled Northumbria in the mid-900s. Second, the English chronicles do record that the great heathen army came to England seeking revenge for a father's death, so there's a kernel of possible truth here. But the snake pit? That's almost certainly mythology. Snakes aren't native to England in the numbers you'd need for an execution like this. More importantly, the snake pit death is a common motif in Norse mythology. It appears in other legends. It's symbolic. Snakes in Norse culture represented enemies, treachery, and fate. Dying in a pit of snakes while remaining defiant is a very Viking way to go out. It's heroic, it's poetic, but it's probably not what actually happened. So here's what we can say with reasonable confidence. In the mid-800s, there were multiple Viking raids on England and France. Some of these raids were led by warriors whose sons would go on to conquer large parts of England and establish Viking kingdoms. The English had to pay massive amounts of silver, called Danegeld, to try to make the Vikings go away. This all happened. It's documented. Whether there was one central figure named Ragnar who was the father of all these conquerors, or whether storytellers created that narrative to connect various historical events and people, that's the mystery. What we're seeing is how legends form. Real events happen, real people do extraordinary things, then over time those stories get told and retold. Details get exaggerated, different stories get merged, mythological elements get added, and eventually you have a legend that's based on truth but is no longer purely true. Think about it like this. If someone 200 years from now tried to figure out who the real Wyatt Earp was, they'd have a problem. There was a real historical Wyatt Earp, but there are also dozens of movies, TV shows, and books about him, many of which contradict each other and add fictional elements. Future historians would have to sift through all of that and try to figure out what actually happened. That's exactly what historians are doing with Ragnar Lothbrok, except the trail is 1,000 years old and the sources are much thinner.
Here's why this matters. The legend of Ragnar Lothbrok isn't just entertainment. It tells us something important about how the Vikings saw themselves and how they wanted to be remembered. The sagas were written in Iceland in the 13th century, long after the Viking Age had ended. By then, Iceland was Christian, and the Old Norse culture was fading. The saga writers were looking back at the Viking Age with a mixture of nostalgia, pride, and imagination. They were trying to preserve their cultural identity by creating these larger-than-life heroes. Ragnar represents the ideal Viking, brave, clever, ambitious, willing to challenge authority and explore the unknown. He's a farmer who becomes a king through his own merit. He's a strategist who outsmarts his enemies. He's a man who faces death with courage and defiance. Whether or not the historical Ragnar existed, the character represents something real about Viking culture and values. And this is why the Vikings TV series resonated with so many people. It taps into that same archetype, the underdog who rises, the explorer who discovers new worlds, the warrior who refuses to submit. These are universal stories. They work whether we're talking about Vikings or cowboys or space explorers. The details change, but the themes remain. So, did Ragnar Lothbrok exist? The honest answer is probably not as one single person who did everything the legends claim. But could there have been a Viking warrior named Ragnar who did some impressive things and whose story became the foundation for the legend? Absolutely. Could his sons have been real historical figures who conquered England? Yes, some of them definitely were. Is the story we have a mixture of history, mythology, and medieval storytelling? Without question. The rise of Ragnar Lothbrok, whether he was one man or many, represents one of the most successful periods of Viking expansion. It represents the moment when Scandinavia exploded onto the European stage and changed the course of history. The Vikings didn't just raid, they settled, they founded cities, they established trade routes, they influenced languages and cultures, and they did it with a boldness and ferocity that made them legendary. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with me through this historical mystery. Now here's what I need from you. First, hit that like button if this made you think differently about Ragnar and the Vikings. Second, drop a comment. Tell me, do you think Ragnar Lothbrok was a real person or a legendary composite? I genuinely want to know what you think, and I read every single comment. Third, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because we're going to keep digging into history's greatest mysteries and separating fact from fiction. And if you're hungry for more Viking content, check out the video I'll link in the description about the real history of Viking raids. It'll blow your mind how much the popular image of Vikings gets wrong. Horned helmets? Nope. Dirty savages? Actually, they were known for being remarkably clean. Mindless berserkers? They were sophisticated traders and explorers. There's so much more to the story. The legend of Ragnar Lothbrok endures because it speaks to something deep in us, the desire to explore beyond our borders, the courage to challenge the powerful, the determination to be remembered. Whether he was one man or many, myth or reality, Ragnar represents an era when the impossible became possible and legends were born. And isn't that what makes history so fascinating? Not just what happened, but what we choose to remember and why. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.